Today, we're tackling an important but often overlooked aspect of financial equality, the gender pension gap. This is the fourth installment of our series on pay equity, and joining me is Commissioner Katie Philp from Ontario's Pay Equity Office, who will help us understand why this gap exists and what can be done to close it. We're taking a rapid fire approach to our questions today to get to the heart of the matter quickly. Katie, it's great to have you back.
I love being here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, let's kick things off by defining the gender pension gap and why should we be concerned about it?
Well, okay, the gender pension gap is similar to the gender wage gap. It's really the disparity in retirement income between men and women. And it's measured across the three pillars of Canada's retirement income system, which are, in case listeners don't know, the Old Age Security and Guaranteed Income Supplement, the Canadian Pension Plan, or the Quebec pension plan if you're in Quebec, and private retirement income. So each pillar impacts a gender pension disparity in a unique way. But ultimately, we're looking at what is that gender disparity.
So, can you describe then the current state of the gender pension gap and how wide it is today?
So the gender pension gap currently sits at 17%. So that means for every dollar of
Wow.
retirement income that a man receives, a woman will receive 83 cents. What's so fascinating about that is when we started this research, we had this hypothesis that the gender pension gap would be closing over time because women have increased labor market participation. And we do see the gender wage gap closing over time. But in fact, in 1976, when they first started measuring gender pension gaps, it was at 15%. So it's actually widened
Wow.
nominally, but still we should look at it because of that.
So, what are the key factors then that contribute to creating this gap in pension earnings between the genders?
Really good question, which is why we commissioned this report to dive into it. And I'll give you like the rapid fire answer. Comes down to, it's multifaceted first, but comes down to the actual design of the Canadian retirement system. And so in the 1960s, the federal government decided to make public pensions primarily dependent on labor market earnings and to keep public pensions small. So private pensions, which were also dependent on labor market earnings, would have room to grow. And this had very direct gendered impacts, which I'm not sure they understood at the time. But now that we're revealing that it does, we can look at it closely. So, poverty relief, something like the old age security is fairly gender neutral. CPP though is tied to timed work and compensation level across a whole lifetime. And this favors men. We've had conversations about women's, increased responsibilities in care and unpaid work, which obviously affects their paid work or how much time they can spend in the paid labor market. So that's a big issue that we have to talk about around this. Then, of course, finally, workplace and personal pensions. So private pensions actually contribute the largest share of overall pension income, but at the same time make the largest contribution, the overall gender pension gap. And so, it's a similar concept. Workplace pensions greatly benefit individuals who spend their entire career with one employer, which generally favors men. And it's based on contribution of hours worked. So we're still not addressing this challenge that women have in terms of hours worked.
You touched on this a little bit. So, why is the Pay Equity Office deciding to focus on the gender pension gap now? What makes the issue so critical?
Well, our office we have a statutory mandate to actually look at the gender wage gap and everything around it. And so when we started, last year 2022, we did a really kind of high level look at other things associated with the gender wage gap. And the gender pension came up as something that was interesting. So we did, surface level research, and then we thought we should do more. And I think, part of our mandate is to talk very specifically about the gender wage gap, but more broadly about the other gendered impacts or gender aspects of the workforce that affect women and women's economic health. So this is why we're looking at this, and we've worked with Dr. Elizabeth Shilton from Queen's University to help us understand what is it and why it exists, so we can have better understanding of the issue. So relevant policymakers and private sector, everybody who's a part of this, can look at it and come up with solutions.
That 17% is burned into my brain right now. This is a really significant gap. So, what steps can women take on their own to improve their retirement income prospects?
Yeah, and this is a trope, but knowledge is power. I think part of the research that we're putting out is so women can be aware and be informed as much as they can around the issues. But there's a limit to what individual women can do, and this is a systemic policy design issue. Policy choices were made in the 1960s that have had gendered impact intentionally or unintentionally, but now we see that they do. So I think, there's a limit to what women can do, but being educated for sure. I think as a society, we have to shift our attitudes. We've talked about this in other segments about women's work and the value we place on these roles, and women's unpaid work that actually limits participation, and look at this, this contribution, the way that we measure it, and it comes back in economic prosperity for women. Because obviously the more women prosper financially, obviously all of us prosper.
And, obviously the pay equity office is doing their part. Women will have to, carry a heavy load to do their part. Is there anybody else responsible for addressing the gender pension gap?
Well, I think, employers who offer retirement benefits and the financial institutions that they work with, who actually manage those funds, could play a really important role here in actually reflecting on the way that their benefits and their retirement packages are structured, to see if there is a unintentional gendered lens. We know there is, because we can see it in the data that's available. But I think they can play a really crucial role. If you're an employer, you're listening and you work in HR or whatever, you can think about, how do you bring this back to your office to start to question and look at the structure of your benefits programs. Government bodies who are responsible for overseeing pension plans can do the same thing. These are primarily federally run programs. So I think, getting this on the radar of advocates. We are not an advocacy body, the Pay Equity Office. We are a research and regulatory body. But I think getting this in front of the advocates and getting it in front of policymakers so they can look at, the unintended consequences of the design decisions they made in the 1960s.
I think as you're speaking, I really think this is something that most people are not intentionally ignoring. They may just not be aware of it. It's something I had never really thought of before, but of course it makes sense, right? When you start to actually track how this will eventually end up, it is going to end up with a big impact in retirement. So what specific measures should the government implement to aid in closing the gender pension gap?
Well, I think it's important from a government perspective to recognize that there's multiple government bodies play roles in this. It's human resources and skills development on the federal level, and economic and social development in Canada, women and gender in the economy, wage. Like there's multiple players, and I think we've got to show the data to get their attention so they can think about the policy constructs. Because, there's responsibilities that cover a wide policy range. And I think that this is something, ideally we create this research so it gets into their hands and they think about the policy constructs that exist. And I think that's the most important things government should do, and they're there to do, is look at the policy environment and the impacts of policy. And I think it's time to have the conversation at the federal level, at least around the way that the system was designed and what they can do.
So if people want to know more then about your efforts and about the data and the information that's out there, where can they go, Katie?
We have this report launched on our website. So if you go to payequity.gov.on.ca, you should see it in the banner. It'll be front and center because we really want to get this information out there. Also on our website, if you just scroll through, you will see a gender pension link directly. So our website is a great source of information. And I would encourage people to read this report. It's fascinating. It's written in plain, accessible language. And it's meant to really raise the profile of this issue and provide data that's been missing around the conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Katie, so much for joining me today. I think this one was a really crucial discussion and that people are not talking about enough. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.